So good morning, good afternoon to everyone joining us today. I think we're just about ready to get started. Welcome to the final webinar in the 2018 Climate Tracking and Transparency webinar series. My name is Cynthia Elliott. I'm an associate with the climate program at WRI, and I'm joined today by a number of WRI colleagues. I'm going to provide a very brief introduction to today's webinar, and then I'll be handing things over to our presenters who will be providing an overview of approaches to tracking the implementation of policies and actions and share some information about a new tool being developed. This webinar series is co-organized by World Resources Institute's Tracking and Strengthening Climate Action Initiative, or TASCA, together with the Partnership on Transparency in the Paris Agreement known as PATPA, in order to share existing knowledge and best practice related to improving domestic transparency systems. Next slide, please. So on today's webinar, I'm going to provide some basic instructions for participation, provide a brief overview of TASCA and PATPA, and then we'll hear from our two guest presenters. Presentations will be followed by a question and answer session where attendees will be able to submit questions directly to the panelists. Next slide, please. During this webinar, attendees will remain in listen-only mode. Participants may raise comments or questions throughout the webinar by typing them into the questions pane in the GoToWebinar control panel. If you're having trouble with audio or video or submitting questions, please send me a message. This webinar is being recorded and will be made available online. Next slide, please. The TASCA project is managed by WRI and aims to support governments to be able to transparently communicate progress toward their NDCs, meet international accounting and reporting requirements, account for their commitments, identify additional abatement opportunities to support national dialogue on future commitments. We currently work in 5 countries: Colombia, Ethiopia, India, Indonesia, and South Africa. But specific activities depend on each country, and lessons learned and resources developed are shared globally. In addition to our work in country, TASCA actively supports enhancing international transparency. We provide timely research and analysis to support the negotiations and convene dialogues and discussions with country parties to consider different options. We are also developing new tools and data platforms to support analysis for decision-making and tracking implementation. Next slide, please. The Partnership on Transparency in the Paris Agreement was launched in 2010 at the Petersberg Climate Dialogue by South Africa, the Republic of Korea, and Germany. PATPA promotes ambitious climate action through practical exchange on enhanced transparency to support achievement of the global temperature goal. PATPA supports its mission through policy dialogues and convenings to build capacity and encourage peer exchange, and develops research products to disseminate knowledge. Next slide, please. Now, to get into the core of today's webinar, we have 2 experts from WRI joining us today. First, we'll hear from Taryn Fransen, followed by Mengpin. So with that, let me please hand things over to Taryn.
Good morning, everyone. I'm going to start off by providing a bit of background around some of the policy tracking tools that WRI has developed in the past and look a little bit at how they've been applied. Just to set the stage for Mengpin to talk in more detail about the new tool that we are currently developing under TASCA. So just to start off with some groundwork on policy implementation tracking. I'll go over some key terminology that comes up in some of the tools that have been developed to date. So in terms of tracking different goals and policies, there are several different types of goals and policies that we track with the series of tools that we're going to be talking about. So the first is a mitigation goal, which is a commitment to reduce or limit the increase of GHG emissions by a specified amount by a specified date. And then on the policy side, we have both sort of broad plans or policies, which are high-level documents or declarations defining broad objectives, as well as specific policy instruments, which are specific mechanisms that obligate or incentivize technological or behavioral change. So a specific policy instrument might be something like a feed-in tariff or an energy efficiency standard, whereas a broad plan or policy might be a country's entire climate change plan or strategy, which could require many different policy instruments in order to implement. We also look at policies that are in different stages of implementation in terms of their status. So we consider a policy to be adopted when an official government decision has been made and there's a clear commitment to proceed with implementation. And we consider a policy to be implemented according to the IPCC definition, which states that policy implementation is evidenced by relevant legislation or regulation, voluntary agreements that are in place, financial or human resources that have been committed to policy implementation, or other input or activity indicators that our framework goes into in more detail. And then finally, we look at milestones or indicators pertaining to policy implementation status. So a milestone would be a specific action or decision by relevant government authority representing progress towards policy adoption. And an indicator would be a metric that describes the performance of a policy. And we look at several different classes of indicators, including input to the policy, activity in carrying it out, and its effect on impacts such as greenhouse gas emissions. So that's just a broad overview of some of the terminology. Before I go further into that, on the next slide, I want to speak a little bit about the objectives, about why we track policy implementation. And we can think of this in three categories. There are kind of overarching objectives that apply both domestically and internationally. And then countries also have their own domestic purposes for why they want to track policy implementation. And then there are also international applications of this as well. And we're typically, in our experience, we've typically been working with countries and tracking policy implementation at the national level. Tracking national policies can have benefits in all three of these categories. Many of the tools that we've developed are not specific to countries. They could also be used, for example, by subnational actors, by regions, et cetera. It just so happens that much of our experience is at the national level. Anyway, in terms of objectives, on the overarching side, we track policy implementation to improve transparency and accountability, to help facilitate attribution of changes in greenhouse gas emissions to specific policy interventions. So, of course, greenhouse gas emissions in a country can fluctuate for many reasons, including reasons that aren't related to policy. So perhaps due to macroeconomic factors. And tracking implementation cannot establish firmly causation of GHG changes to policies, but it can help provide context to whether that policy might have been having an impact. It can shed light on the quality of the process of implementation and provide an early view on policy effectiveness. So often if we're looking only at a final indicator like GHG emissions or like changes in the energy mix or something physical of that nature, often we'll only see that impact after policy implementation has been underway for some time. Tracking the process of policy implementation can help us have an earlier view of how effective the policy might turn out to be before we're able to see those final impacts. And then finally, it can inform projections of future GHG emissions. So often when we're developing GHG scenarios, we need to make some assumptions about whether given policies will be or are being fully implemented, whether they're likely to have an impact. So tracking the implementation of policies can help us make an informed decision when doing that type of analysis. Then at the domestic level, in addition to tracking progress toward implementation, this process can help identify priority areas for action. So where perhaps more aggressive interventions need to be made in order to ensure effectiveness. It can also potentially be helpful in attracting international finance because it provides transparency around the implementation process and the likely effectiveness. At the international level, there are international reporting procedures that can benefit from additional information about policy implementation, including the national communications and the biennial reports and the biennial update reports. And the Paris Agreement, of course, also contains some language around tracking progress made in policy implementation, the details of which are all still being worked out and negotiated. So moving on to the next slide, I wanted to talk a little bit about some of the tools in our toolkit that are relevant to policy tracking. We have 3 key tools that have been developed in the past. 2 were developed under the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, and then the third was developed under the Open Climate Network in consultation with the Greenhouse Gas Protocol. These are all partnerships in which WRI plays a part, a leading role, along with many other organizations that have also contributed to these tools. The first is the mitigation goal standard. On the left there, that addresses how to assess and report the overall progress towards national, subnational, and sectoral greenhouse gas reduction goals. In the middle, we have the Greenhouse Gas Protocol Policy and Action Standard, which addresses how to estimate the change in greenhouse gas emissions and removals caused by specific policies and actions. And then on the right, we have the Climate Policy Implementation Tracking Framework, which supports monitoring progress towards policy adoption and implementation, and also provides guidance for evaluating institutional and governance factors that influence the effectiveness of policy implementation. So it's designed to be used ideally in combination with the policy and action standard. So the policy and action standard will tell you about the GHG impacts of your policy, and the implementation tracking framework will help you track the progress of that policy using a range of metrics and indicators at different phases. So it's this last framework on policy implementation tracking that the tool that Mengpin will be presenting kind of builds off of. So I wanted to mention a few, well, I guess for additional context, the mitigation goal standard and the policy and action standard have been widely used and adopted by many different governments as well as by analysts. The implementation tracking framework is newer and has not been as widely adopted, but I wanted to mention a few examples of how we have used it in partnership with other analysts, and then we'll go into the new tool. So on the next slide, the first example is this is a paper on pathways for meeting India's climate goals that was prepared by WRI India in partnership with several Indian organizations. This paper actually used, I believe, all 3 of those tools that I just mentioned to do a very comprehensive assessment. It used the mitigation goals standard to evaluate progress toward India's carbon intensity goal, which is shown in the middle chart. And it also used the policy and action standard and the implementation tracking framework to evaluate progress on 10 of India's most critical climate policies, which are shown in the graphic at the right. And you can just sort of see it, there's a lot of underlying analysis in this assessment, but it sort of provides a high-level snapshot of where policy implementation was at the time this paper was published. On the next slide, this tracking framework has also been used to assess implementation progress of China's of the climate policies in China's 12th five-year plan. And then on the next slide, a similar analysis was done by our Brazilian colleagues, looking at implementation progress and governance arrangements for several of Brazil's key climate policies. So moving on to the next slide, we're going to transition now into talking about the tracking tool that's under development. But I think our experience with the tracking framework in particular, and the experience of our colleagues has been that it is quite a useful tool, but it is quite data and labor intensive to apply. And our experience with it has been that there's a major challenge in collecting information that's actually necessary to track policy progress according to the framework and the indicators that have been developed. So I think with this new tool, part of our objective is to address those challenges that we've encountered in applying the implementation tracking framework and to come up with something that will be a bit more user-friendly and that can hopefully enjoy more widespread adoption to help users tackle this challenge of tracking policy implementation. So with that, I will hand it over to Mengpin to continue the presentation.
Thank you, Taryn, and thank you, Cynthia, for the introduction earlier. Good morning, afternoon to everyone, and thanks for joining. My name is Mengpin, and I'm with the Climate Data Team in the Global Climate Program here at the World Resources Institute. As Taryn has introduced, I will be presenting a new tool we are developing. The goal of the tool is to build capacity for national governments to track the implementation effects and progress of their climate actions. The tool is part of the TASCA project and the larger effort convened by WRI in providing tools and resources for tracking implementation and effects of countries' NDCs and underlying policies that support them, and to strengthen climate action. The purpose of the tool is to help users take stock of their climate actions, contribute to transparency and communication of progress made, identify gaps for actions or financial resources that needed, with the international reporting requirements in mind, as there have been many, as Taryn introduced, and more to be agreed at the upcoming COP, and to inform decision-making by relevant stakeholders. The primary audience of the tool are government officials, implementers of the NDCs, or relevant subject experts. This being said, as other tools we have been developing here at WRI, this tool, once built and published, will be provided for free and available for public download, access, and use. Next slide. So over the past several years, WRI has built a strong base of knowledge, products, tools, and resources in climate policy tracking. The main asset, as Taryn has introduced earlier, are the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, Mitigation Goal Standard, Policy and Action Standard, the Climate Policy Implementation Tracking Framework. The tool has been designed on the basis of the methodology established by the two standards and the framework. WRI also has a long history building online and offline tools and data platforms. Excuse me. Offline tools such as Excel-based calculation tools for the Greenhouse Gas Protocol standards. Here's a screenshot of the Policy and Action Standard as an example. There's also one accompanying Mitigation Goal Standard and many other Greenhouse Gas Protocol standards and tools. WRI has also been known as a well-recognized resource for climate-relevant datasets, including greenhouse gas emission inventories, NDCs information, and pre-2020 pledges. Those datasets are published through the Climate Watch platform. The platform has been introduced in an earlier webinar, so I will not get into the details here. There are more platforms being built. The screenshot showing here is a platform that has been developed per request and in collaboration with the South Africa government to visualize their biannual update report. The platform will soon be published in the upcoming COP in December. An India platform is also in development that builds on the policy tracking components on the publication that Taryn has just introduced earlier. Now we have introduced the knowledge base. The next two slides provide some more context and background, and hopefully would give a sense of scale for the possible application of such a tracking tool. The NDCs, or nationally determined contributions, are submitted by countries to the UNFCCC under the Paris Agreement. I checked yesterday, and 180 countries have submitted their first NDCs, and one country, which is Marshall Island, has taken the lead and submitted its second NDC. So combined with the INDCs, stands for Intended Nationally Determined Contributions, that countries submitted in the lead up to Paris following Lima decision, 195 parties out of the 197 parties of the UNFCCC have communicated officially their intended efforts to address climate change and adapt to the effects of it. Syria and Libya are the only two parties that don't have an NDC or INDC, though Libya is a signatory to the Paris Agreement, and Syria has officially joined the Paris Agreement. The screenshot here is taken from the Climate Watch platform on the NDC module. It gives an overview and breakdown of the different types of contributions countries have submitted in their NDCs. The vast majority of the NDCs include a greenhouse gas reduction target. Over 30 NDCs didn't have an economy-wide greenhouse gas target. Those countries communicate policies and actions as their primary contribution. The next slide shows a visual from the Climate Change Laws of the World database published by the Grantham Research Institute. The map shows a global picture of the over 1,500 climate change laws and policies covering areas including mitigation, adaptation, transitions to low carbon economy for almost all countries in the world. And an example country in Indonesia is highlighted here. Indonesia is one of the top 10 emitters of greenhouse gas emissions in the world, and it has over 20 climate policies, which is more than most of the countries in the world. Next slide, please. So to recap and also reiterate what Taryn has mentioned, with the many climate actions in plan and laws and policies in place for almost all countries in the world, there is a strong need for tracking policy implementation. As Taryn has introduced earlier, implementation tracking is important in many ways, internationally and domestically. Under the Paris Agreement, each party shall regularly provide information necessary to track progress made in implementing and achieving its NDC for transparency and to inform the global stocktake. There have been existing reporting requirements under the UNFCCC transparency system. This includes national communications, national inventory reports, and biannual reports for developed country parties, and biannual update report and national communications for developing country parties. Also, more guidance will be agreed upon for reporting under the Paris Agreement. Tracking the effects and implementation of climate actions and transparently communicating progress also provides meaningful information to domestic audiences. This helps them identify priority areas for action and also resource needs that would attract international, financial, and other resources. Next slide, please. The cycle of implementation tracking for using this tool would ideally start from the planning stage, where implementers would understand the commitments being made, aligning international commitments with domestic policies and priorities, and create a plan for tracking, which would include responsible entities, tracking frequency, data sources for indicators that need data collection efforts, etc. During implementation, users will collect and calculate performance indicators and assess progress. By tracking the effects and implementation of the action and assessing progress towards them, This will also enable users to fulfill any international reporting requirements or domestic reporting needs, such as communicating progress to national stakeholders or key international stakeholders, such as donors. The scope of the tool at the moment is limited to the tracking part, with the idea to inform the planning and reporting stages. Users of the tool are also encouraged to share publicly and communicate transparently progress and information used for tracking implementation, and at the end of the cycle, come up with new actions with increased ambition and continue to track progress of them. Reporting through an online platform is entirely voluntary and currently not in scope of this tool. But we hope that if possible, by sharing the best practices among countries in terms of tracking progress, it would help build trust among countries, and the international community would also benefit from enhanced transparency and increased ambition. So with the scope in mind, I would like to briefly explain the architecture and structure of the tool. The tool starts with a dashboard that provides an overview of progress and actions being made. Here I have been using climate actions, targets, and the concept goals and policies that Taryn has introduced earlier interchangeably and loosely to refer to the various types of targets, policies, actions, and goals being tracked here. So in this tool, we categorize climate actions into 5 groups. Greenhouse gas in the red boxes shown here. Greenhouse gas reduction target, which is straightforward and widely applicable. Non-greenhouse gas target, which are generally targets for a specific sector. Adaptation goals that can be outcome-based, visionary, or process goals. Policies and actions that we generally follow the climate policy implementation tracking framework that Taryn has introduced in greater detail. And lastly, finance and support, which can be in forms of financial resources, technical, and capacity building. For each of the items being tracked, an individual page will be available with the detailed information for tracking. The tool can be used before implementation to inform data collection efforts, during implementation to assess progress remaining and areas that need further actions, and at the end of the implementation period to evaluate whether the target has been achieved or not and inform the next round of actions. So now I would like to turn to the actual wireframes of the implementation tracking tool and walk you through the different concepts of it. The first screen shown here is the dashboard. One disclaimer upfront is that all the data here, they might look real, they are dummy data and should not be mistaken as real data. So the dashboard provides an overview of the targets being tracked here, including a quick snapshot of the target's progress being made if it's a quantitative target, or current status if it's a policy. It also shows whether a target is being tracked or not, depending on data availability. For example, you can lay out the tool and list all the items to be tracked in the tool first and add data as they are available. The dashboard also includes detailed data for each individual items being tracked, such as the visuals showing base year, target year, and tracking year values side by side for tracking progress towards quantitative targets, time series data if they're available, or high-level descriptions. User can also add a target, which a pop-up window will guide you to individual page for the target for editing the corresponding indicators depending on the type of the target. So next slide, please. So on greenhouse gas targets, each target has an individual page that can be navigated from the dashboard. From the dashboard, we can get to a detailed page for this greenhouse gas reduction target. The page shows the description of the target, such as target type, implementation timeframe, scope and coverage, and the methodology notes, such as an accounting approach for the land sector, use of international market mechanisms, and the progress visual, which is the same as the one you have seen in the dashboard. And the tool also allows for editing and saving. Certain indicators are selections from the drop-down menus, and some are text fields. The indicators can also be quite different depending on the types of greenhouse gas targets. For example, baseline scenario target would require information on the baseline projections, and intensity goals would require data sources on the level of output to be used for calculating the intensity. And from the detailed page, you can always navigate back to the dashboard. For a given non-greenhouse gas target, the multiple indicators can be used to assess one target and can be toggled here. The detailed page would include description of the targets, such as the cost and support needs, the progress towards the overall renewable target, and progress for, as an example here, and progress for installed solar and wind capacity. Adaptation goals, as we explained earlier, can be outcome-based goals, as the example shown here, which enables numerical tracking. Similar to the ones we have seen above, it can also be process goals, which would be quite similar to the policies we will talk about in a second, and visionary goals that don't have concrete actions or plans laid out. The example shown here is a target to eliminate malaria by 2030. The details showing sectors affected, implementing entity, estimated total cost, and the progress section tracks progress with data sources, monitoring frequency, and the time series data. As in all the individual target pages, a navigation bar is at the bottom for easy browse to other adaptation goals here or other targets within that same category. So back to the dashboard on the policy section, the high-level detail shows the status of the policy, a concept Taryn has introduced earlier, and the responsible entities and the sectors affected. And the detailed page describes the policy in a few indicators, such as whether the policy is a broad policy or not, the description of the policy, whether the policy instruments have been identified. It then shows the details of the policy instruments, such as the title, the status. It also allows for recording and the tracking status of the legislation milestones. Next slide, please. The details of the milestones. The details of the milestones include timeframe, status, implementing entity, last update, etc. And the performance indicators can also be tracked here, such as greenhouse gas impact, as an example here. Next slide, please. Sorry, this one. So this is an area we can devote another entire webinar on, how to design performance indicators for tracking policy implementation. But to give a few examples, it can vary from the amount of financial resources allocated, number of certificates issued, behavior changes, or greenhouse gas and non-greenhouse gas effects as shown here. So next slide. Next, finally, on the finance and support, this shows an example of project where the country is a recipient of the support. A multilateral donor provided financial resources for the government to develop its second biannual update report. The type of support is financial resources. Other details captured here include the funding status, which has been received, the amount received, project is in progress, and other details that you can see here. So this wraps up the walkthrough of the wireframes. So hopefully by now it gives you a good flavor and sense of the tool in terms of the scope, concept, and functionalities. In terms of the tool development timeline, we have been scoping out this tool and conduct user consultations since last year, and started tool design since April this year with internal testing, collecting feedback for initial implementation. We hope that by June next year, we would have tested the tool in 3 to 5 countries, and which would inform the further refinement of the tool, after which we will release the tool for public use and conduct further outreach of it. So stay tuned. Before I close, I do want to touch upon a few limitations and disclaimer of the tool, on what this tool does and does not do. First thing I'd like to mention is that the tool is entirely voluntary, and countries and users can choose to take its use in part or fully, depending on their interests and needs. This is not a mandatory tool or official, and there will not be technical assessment of the results from using the tool. The second thing to mention is that the policy is designed to be policy neutral. We have designed broad categories with the hope that the 5 categories would capture the vast majority of the types of climate actions being taken. Although the primary audiences are national governments, it can potentially be used by a wide range of audiences fulfilling different tracking needs at the national, subnational, or even businesses with climate action plans and targets. Next, as I have briefly mentioned earlier, the tool will be available for public download and use, and all of the data input to the tool for tracking and evaluating progress will be provided by the users. The tool will be published with guidance on how to use the tool in general, but there will be no validation of the data from the WRI side. Lastly, this tool is not an MRV tool or an accounting calculation tool. It doesn't get into the details such as reporting on national inventories of anthropogenic emissions and removals from the various sourcing categories and breakdown by the 7 greenhouse gases. It also does not capture the caveats that have been detailed in the greenhouse gas protocol tools in terms of accounting methodologies. It also doesn't provide modeling capability for future emission scenarios. Although, as Taryn has mentioned earlier, information provided by using this tool can potentially help inform the projections of future emissions. Users are encouraged to use other tools and resources provided by WRI and partners for those specific purposes and apply the results of the calculations as part of the data input to this tool for tracking progress. So in summary, we hope that the tool is a user-friendly, policy-neutral tool that builds capacity for tracking climate actions through a dashboard, and that would hopefully encourage transparency and enhanced ambition. So this wraps up my part of the presentation. Thank you so much for your attention. So I will now hand it back to Cynthia.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Mengpin. Thank you also to Taryn. Thank you both for your excellent presentations. At this point, we are now able to open the floor up to questions from participants. If you have a question or a comment you'd like to share with the presenters, please type it into the questions pane in your GoToWebinar control panel, and we will try to address them in the remaining time available. So while we are waiting for questions to come through, I do have one that I'd like to ask both Taryn and Mengpin. And from my side, I'm just curious if you could provide a little bit of detail on what kind of existing resource capacity would be needed for a country to apply the tool. If you have an idea of what an ideal case might look like in terms of a country's data availability on a particular policy that they might like to test out in the tool, or technological resources, data platforms or servers that might be needed to manage this, the application of the tool. I'm curious if you could just talk a little bit about, from your perspective, what resource capacity would be needed. So why don't we start with Mengpin, and then we can move to Taryn?
Yeah, sure. I can provide from a data tools perspective, since I've been working on the Climate Watch platform. One thing I didn't mention is that while users are the one to provide data from the data platforms that we have available on WRI, we do have very detailed information that would get countries in a very good start in using the tool. The information we can provide includes national inventories at the national level from both the official submissions by countries to the UNFCCC, but also third-party data by reputable research institute, including us and the PIC PrimeMap dataset. The other resource we have is we break down the NDCs already by the types of targets and the information provided to facilitate transparency, understanding, and clarity of those targets in our platform. It also includes sectoral targets and actions and plans and goals communicated in the NDCs. We also include did a preliminary assessment of the target level of emissions. So with the historic emissions and target level emissions, countries can already have a good start off by tracking the progress towards their economy-wide greenhouse gas targets if they have one. And we also have the pathways module, which is a repository of various modeling projects and scenarios that can be applicable to the different countries. So that's from the data platform's perspective. In terms of data challenges, as Taryn has mentioned, it has been a major obstacle, and both we already know and also has been raised during the consultations that we have been having with users. This is also one of the benefits for using this tool, is that countries would, by using this tool, have a better MRV system that would help collect those information, and B, by having this tool from the start, they would have this idea in mind in terms of what indicators and what data should be tracked and collected during implementation. That would help facilitate the tracking progress during implementation and reporting on progress at the end of the implementation. So I'll let Taryn speak.
Thanks. I don't think I have a lot to add to that thorough answer. I guess the only thing is just to underscore Mengpin's point, the tool, by providing some default data to start with, we do try to facilitate, I guess, a point of entry into using the tool. But we only have so much data to work with as well, and particularly when it comes to specific policies, often to be able to track these thoroughly, there will be new data collection requirements. So the tool will provide a basis to work off of. It will also, I think, help users identify where additional data collection efforts may be needed. But in certain instances, there's going to be no getting around the fact that additional data collection will be needed in order to sort of fully deploy the tool on every policy. That being said, there are some things that you can do with it, hopefully without taking those additional steps.
Excellent. Thank you so much. So we have another question here related to the audience for the tool. How can the information collected and progress on indicators be adapted for a domestic audience versus an international audience? And does the tool serve both audiences equally? Taryn, can I turn to you first, or should Mengpin respond?
I'll be happy to take a first cut, and then Mengpin can probably speak to this in greater details since she's closer to the design of the tool itself. It definitely is designed to be flexible in its application, so that if a country wants to use it to support its domestic reporting needs, it can do that. If a country wants to use it to support its international reporting needs, it can also do that, although it's certainly not, there's obviously no requirement either domestically or internationally to use the tool. It's merely an option that can support those processes. So Mengpin, do you want to go into any more detail there?
No, I think Taryn have captured well. As I have briefly touched upon in my presentation, that we have tried to design the tool to be policy neutral when we say we target the audience to be national governments, because we think those are the primary users that would have the need for that they would have those international commitments, the national climate laws and policies that they would need to track progress upon. This being said, apparently, if domestic governments, subnational governments, they also have the need to track progress towards their targets and actions, they would, of course, also use the tool and it would apply equally to them. I think the only difference, possibly because I haven't really used it in subnational governments, is that they might have an easier coordination between their different staff in the subnational government. Then you need to coordinate between the different ministries and the national governments, for example. And also, I have briefly touched upon businesses that many of them have now set climate zero emission goals, climate action, science-based targets, renewable energy goals, and they can also use the tool to track their progress, and they would apply, or hopefully apply, the concept.
Excellent, thank you both. So we have a question here. What support is provided by the tool specifically for those countries that are in the process of preparing their second NDC? Mengpin, can I turn to you first?
In terms of the support we can provide to countries, for this tool specifically, we would hopefully do test use of this tool in 3 to 5 countries, which we would do more guidance and training on how to use the tool and input and collect the data for tracking implementation and progress. In terms of how tracking progress affects the second NDCs, I think actually, Xingxia and Taryn, you are better suited to for these questions in terms of how taking stock of the current progress would inform the next NDC. So for example, if you, during your using of the tool, you realized that a intensity tool is harder to take stock of, just for example, or a trajectory tool is hard to take stock of, you might be thinking of designing a type of target that's easier to track progress towards. Or for example, if you, at the end of the cycle, you realize you overshoot your goal or you overachieve your goal, you might be thinking of designing a more ambitious target moving forward. Those are the very easy and straightforward examples, but it can also vary from looking at the indicators here, and you realize those are the information that you could potentially provide in the NDCs already to facilitate transparency and understanding of your commitments. Those are the few examples I could think of, but I would really rely on you and Taryn to give answers.
I mean, I'll hop in. I think that's exactly right. So it makes complete sense to, when designing second NDCs, to take into account of the progress that has been made towards the first round of NDCs. So as Mengpin mentioned, that can be done at the mitigation goal level. There are a number of countries that are likely on track to overachieve their goal, which would be reflected in this tracking. They may want to consider changing their goal to be more ambitious. And then I think the other dimension of that is on the policy level. So countries, if they're designing, if their NDC, and not all of them do contain an overall mitigation goal, but many of them do. In cases where it does, that goal likely has some assumptions baked into it around the supporting policies that will be in place to achieve that goal and what effects that will deliver. So by tracking those individual policies through a tool like this, that may also help the country to calibrate their overall goal, and as well as ensure that they have policies in place that are responding to meeting that goal. So that sort of applies, I would say it kind of applies equally to the current round of NDCs, but also to the next round of NDCs, since that's an opportunity to make adjustments, to add additional policies, to increase ambition. This tool would just provide a more informed way of doing that. That being said, there's obviously a timing issue in the sense that the tool is still going to be in pilot testing during 2019, and many countries are already going to be starting the process of working on their next NDCs. So while we hope that this tool ultimately will be able to support that process, I would also not suggest waiting for it to be finished before getting started.
Okay, thank you. That's great. I don't have anything to add to that. We have another question related to Article 6 of the Paris Agreement. Could the tool help me to prove that my use of Article 6.2 cooperative approaches are supplemental to domestic action?
That is a really interesting question. I'll take a first cut, and then Mengpin and Cynthia, please feel free to chime in. I mean, I think what this tool, the side of that question that this tool will address is the domestic action side. So this tool can help provide sort of a very comprehensive and thorough documentation of what domestic action is being taken and what impact it is having. I don't believe it does anything to address cooperative approaches directly. So my first reaction, although I don't think this is something that we've considered, is that it helps with one side of that equation in terms of documenting the domestic action. But Cynthia or Mengpin, do you want to weigh in further?
I think, Cynthia, you might be better suited to answer this question because I'm not deep into the weeds of the Article 6 of the Paris Agreement.
Yeah, I'm thinking about it. I'm honestly not sure. I think I'd have to think a little bit about how precisely that would work, and specifically what you would have to report, what information you'd need to report, based on applying the tool to really be able to verify or prove that the results are somehow supplemental to domestic action. So I think that's a really interesting question that maybe requires some further thought to really think through specific cases and applications and what results could potentially be used for that purpose. But a good question and definitely something to think about. I think we have time for one more question. This is a pretty general question. Are some policies more challenging to track progress on than others? Are there any policies or actions that you would recommend against trying to track progress on implementation, or any that you think are more conducive to tracking progress?
My impression is that whether, at least from the experience we've had to date with the implementation tracking framework, is that either the ease or difficulty of tracking a particular policy is less around the policy itself and much more around the data availability related to the indicators that a given policy addresses. So if a policy targets a sector, for example, or jurisdiction in which there is high data availability and high transparency, it will be easier to track it. If it's in a sector with low data availability, low transparency, low capacity to gather that data, it will be more challenging. And so that's been a much more important factor than and of course that varies by national context than this, the specific policy. We do provide guidance for developing indicators that can be adapted, I think, to all different kinds of policies. And I don't think, I guess the only other thing I would say on that is I mentioned at the very beginning sort of the differences between specific policy instruments and broad policies and plans. We did run into some instances where you had sort of a broad policy and plan, but it hadn't been fleshed out enough in terms of how it would be implemented, because it was at an early, either it was at an early stage or there wasn't sort of a lot of traction towards its implementation. And if that's the case, it will be much more challenging to develop meaningful indicators. The more sort of concrete and specific the policy is, the easier it is to develop solid indicators.
Thanks, Taryn. Mengpin, do you have anything to add?
I don't have anything to add. I exactly agree with what Taryn just said. I think it really depends on the existing, how the government has been tracking their data and making an effort to make those data transparent and easy to use. And also, I think it applies to not only policies, but just commitments or everything climate actions. And in general, the more detailed it has been provided and the original target or commitment, the easier it is to track progress towards it. And you need to have a clear defined, for example, even time frame to start with, or the base year the target is comparing it against with, or the scope of the target. And the more detailed it provides, the easier it is to track a certain policy and action.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Pauline, if I could ask you to share the next slide. On behalf of TASCA and PAPA, I'd like to thank all of our panelists and our participants for joining us today. If you've enjoyed the webinar, I encourage you to visit our webpage where we'll be sharing information on a new series of webinars we're planning for 2019. If you have any suggestions for topics you'd like to cover, and Mengpin had noted during her presentation that perhaps a topic looking at designing policy indicators for tracking implementation could be a useful topic. If you have any topics you'd like to see us cover, please feel free to get in touch with us. Next slide, please. You can see our contact details are here on this slide. If you're looking for the presentation, it's actually attached in the handouts tab. You can download the presentation there. And please feel free to get in touch with us if you have further questions or would like to talk more about the webinar series. So with that, I'd like to thank you all again, and I hope everyone has a good day. Thanks and goodbye.